In today's episode, we've partnered with Hello Coach to bring you an exclusive offer that will help you unlock your personal and professional potential. At Hello Coach, we believe in the power of coaching to inspire growth, guide self-discovery, and drive meaningful progress in both life and work. With a team of experienced coaches, you'll enjoy personalized 40-minute sessions tailored to your unique goals, whether you prefer the consistency of working with the same coach or the fresh perspective of different ones. Your privacy is always protected, giving you the space to explore your ambitions with complete confidence. Click in the video in the description box below and use the promo code Lunchtime Series to claim your special offer today. Good afternoon and welcome to Lunchtime Series with me, Britz, leading the charge with insights, information, and ultimately effective results in everything coaching, leadership, and marketing. Please remember to like and share and help us grow our channel even further, guys. Joining today is a wonderful, interesting guest, NLP practitioner and recovery coach, who strongly recommends and advocates for the power of resilience and mindset. When we become flexible, quick to bounce back and adjust so that we can overcome obstacles are no longer enemies, but a growth medium in which we can cultivate alternative perspectives and creative options. Please welcome to the show, Magda Dippenaar. How are you doing, Magda?
Good afternoon, Kevin. Lovely to connect again, and thank you for the opportunity. Love what you said there, the power of resilience and then the adjust and overcome. And I'm just thinking how often we would rather embrace a mindset where we expect things is going to be perfect, instead of being okay with what we are come across and then manage that and deal with that. So yeah, thank you for that introduction. Lovely to meet with you again.
Magda, yes, thank you. We've had this conversation a few times already, and we're just back and making sure we get it right. We've had some gremlins joining us. But Magda, today, what we want to be unpacking is emotional resilience, emotional EQ, the importance of emotion. But before we just dive right into that, give us a bit of background. Who are you? Give us some insight on telling us more about that and just letting the audience know a little bit more about you.
Okay. Who am I? I am 54 years of age now. And I think the past few years of my life has been the most enjoyable because of the effort I've spent on getting to know myself. I have two daughters who I love dearly. I do not have an easy road behind me. There's been a lot of challenges to navigate. And I think the lessons in those were amazing. I am passionate also about my faith. I'm a Jesus follower. And I've also seen a lot of resistance in that field, in religion, towards these type of disciplines. I'm glad I've persevered because what I've gained has helped me so much in terms of relationships. When you talk about EQ, I am also asking myself the question, why would we want to understand more about that? And I think for myself, in my past, there's a lot of relationships that a lot of broken relationships and a lot of difficult relationships that we often then just lose instead of learning new ways to navigate ourselves around that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why I think this conversation is so important. And, I still find very often that we know very much we know what the importance of emotions are and how that taps into our worlds. I mean, you and I doing what we do, for us, it's the go-to and the obvious kind of reference to what's happening next in our world. But I mean, where do we start? So where do we start with this conversation around EQ? And I know we've done the talk already, but even maybe reference some of that and give us some structure on what this conversation is about.
Okay. Before we delve into the structure, I think there's a word that I've been embracing lately, and that's the word posture or presence or place. And we are a generation that has so much information to our availability. There's nothing that we cannot attain when it comes to info. But I think when it comes to understanding, embracing, and really taking those things into ourselves to be able then to live different lives, it takes something as simple as so maybe before we go into the structure, I just want to kick off with an analogy and maybe compare a waterfall to a wow. A waterfall is so majestic and amazing to look at, but when you leave there, it doesn't do a lot more for you afterwards. But a wow, and the waterfall is confident in its gush, where the wow is confident in its depth. And when we go into the deeper places, like under the hood, like you would do with your car when you take it for a service, we discover some real secrets there that helps us to live life differently. So I think for me, the first step, a very strategic step would be just to make time to pause and for each of us to find what's deeper on the inside. Why do we have certain triggers? Why do we keep ending up in certain situations, even though we decided not to do that thing again? And sometimes it's those automated patterns that we don't pause to think about. Talking about structure, they have always said cognitive behavioral therapy, that science has always said that there's the situation that then poses a trigger. And as a response to the trigger, the first thing we have is a thought, and then a feeling comes based on the thought, and then we have the reaction that then creates our consequences. But I've started to see with the clients that I serve, because of a certain group of people who often are very sensitive, highly sensitive people, or also like myself, I've realized that a lot of them come into a situation with their feelings first. And when I looked at the science, I almost doubted myself, because there wasn't a lot of talk about the fact that the rule has changed. But I've since I started changing my questions with those clients, instead of what were you thinking, for example, asking what were you feeling, and what's behind the feeling. I think that it was so much easier for them to find and understand themselves, find their responses, and then be able to adjust it for different outcomes.
I love that. And I think I grew up I think I may have shared this with you, but I grew up in an environment where having feelings was shamed. And I'm sure, from our backgrounds as well, you relate, because, as children, we kind of grow up and going, well, especially boys, don't be so emotional. Why are you crying? Why are you showing such emotion? And I remembered as a child being shamed for it, where today I realize and I acknowledge and know in my being that it's an unbelievable, beautiful indicator that something's happening. And when I recognize that indication of what the emotion is bringing to the fore, I immediately ask myself, okay, what am I trying to understand about this feeling? Or become really curious about my feeling, right? So I love the fact that that's even your kind of approach with your clients as well, because very often, and Brené Brown also explains with her book, I can't think of the book now, I have it here somewhere, my little busy office, but that book speaks about, understanding emotions, and what we tend to do is clump up certain types of emotion as one thing. And we know the big negative ones, that the emotions that we experience. But Brené Brown goes to the point of unpacking that and explaining to that point that sometimes the emotion that I'm feeling, I group up as sadness, because that's the only reference I really have to it. When there could be a plethora, and I know that you've touched on this before, of, how many emotions we do have, but we kind of tend to just stick to, well, it's sadness, or it's guilt, or it's shame, and it's not a full understanding. But I love the fact that, really unpacking that feeling, because then there's an awareness of the feeling of, I don't know what that feeling is, or I've associated this situation with a feeling, right? Sorry,
Yes.
Going.
And I think if I think back on what you said, the words that stood out for me were curious and shame, and the fact that we would want to group or classify, and I think maybe below that would be the desire to control, because we feel safer when we can control everything around us. But what happens when we cannot control that? When we have a child that is just so sensitive that we think we're doing the right things, but we do not get the response we want to get. If we want to then get behind that, it's to not judge. And we always think of judge as something where we think that we are better than someone else or we look down on them, but it's as simple as making a decision. So we want to make a decision about something based on what we see outwardly. But when we pause and we make time to find what's inside, just like a well, you can see the waterfall clearly, you can't see the well. When you make time to find out how deep it is, what it has to supply, when you get the supply out of that, like for example, a sensitive child, how beautiful is it when you tap into the emotions and take it for what it is, be curious about it and not judge it. You spoke about how crying was shamed, and it's a known fact even with girls as well, and I think it's related to cultures as well. In the culture that I grew up in, crying is something you go and do in the bathroom. And you don't cry in front of people, but excitement and happiness is something you can do in front of people. So that is also, it almost paralyzed us in the place of living our lives fully. Talking about emotions on a spectrum, we know sadness, we know anger, we know happiness. But for example, with anger, that's the loud emotion. That's when we see that blow up and we then judge that person for their anger. But if we make time to sit with that and not say that there's a bad emotion, but rather find the story behind the emotion, we can then, and I'm going to make myself vulnerable and share some of my story. When I was in school years, teenage years, I had a very bad skin, a breakout that I would some days just think I'm going to stay in the cupboard and not even be seen in my own home. And you go through situations where people would look down on you or would shame you. And when you don't deal with that, and you allow that emotion to grow, and there's not a place where you can talk about it, easily escalates to the place where the anger becomes a blow up instead of just looking at the emotion and asking questions about it, like you said, being curious.
Yeah, and I think it's so important because we carry these stories, right? We carry these ideas and identities from, and I think when you mentioned the importance of questions, I've also I use this reference quite often, and I've had it with more than one client. But part of really identifying what someone's going through, and just with a series of questions, really unpacking what's happening, and then understanding in the moment. I simply ask the question: is what it is you're feeling? Is it your voice you're hearing, or is it someone else's voice? Right. And the moment the client recognizes that it's potentially not their voice, one significant moment like this was someone's grandmother, nonchalantly kind of said at 8 years old, said to my client, well, if it wasn't for you being born, your mother would have been so much more in her life. And she said that in passing, and she remembers this as a triggered kind of conversation. And when I asked, is that your voice, or is it your, whose voice is that? And she immediately went to, how's my grandmother's voice? She immediately recognized that the enormity of the emotion, the stuckness, the not being good enoughness kind of came from that one single moment where it was a definitive life decision that her brain now decided, well, from here on out, you would need to have to prove that you're worthy enough, you're worth enough. And like you say, that moment of being in a cupboard or sitting because just trying to avoid, I've had, speaking with my hands, people have always mocked me. It was like, why do you always speak with your hands? And I'm like, this is how I speak, right? Yeah. To the point where it eventually got, where I wouldn't speak, I would hide my hands. I would put my hands in my pocket. Like we make these enormous kind of life decisions of identifying based on an experience. And then we also impose meaning onto that life experience. So it's quite definitive when we start realizing what those stories are and how they drive emotion, and how that emotion, as you say, that triggered perspective, becomes the loud part of that behavior. And you kind of go, why am I behaving like this? Why, and yet we don't always understand our own emotional responses.
Yes. Stories, emotions on a timeline, and identity. And I think those three things that I'm getting from what you're saying can tie together so powerfully, because if we look at emotions on a timeline, like what you say, for example, about your hands, and that was in a certain time in your life, with a certain group of people, a certain maturity level or level of development in your own life. And what that is now, even though you still have that where you talk with your hands, it has become something that is beautiful and that adds power to what you say when you talk. So we unfortunately form our identities based on the emotions that were overpowering and overwhelming in those first 7 formative years. So while you're talking about that, I'm just imagining if there's space, for example, to help children during those ages to just look at their emotions differently, because we then allow what we feel to form us. But as you move through life and you get to know more about your identity, you just learn that there's options to respond differently or to tell the story differently. Not see the story anymore as there's something wrong with talking with your hands, but see the story as how it is showing your involvement and your passion about what you are sharing. So for me, in terms of emotional intelligence, and if we think about the 5 main bullet points there, self-awareness, then self-management, self-motivation, and then other awareness or awareness of the people around us, and then empathy or sympathy. So if we look at self-awareness, let's say we look at identity through those lenses, and we look at placing ourselves on a continuum, for example, where 1 would be very insecure and 10 would be very confident. And when we can see that, and we can see when we enter into a conversation with someone else with high levels of insecurity, how it affects our awareness of what's happening around us. For example, high levels of insecurity could lead us into self-promotion, which means we'll be so busy with ourselves that we won't, for example, recognize a lot of the other person in the room or in the conversation. So confidence on the other side, when we are confident in who we are, even with our imperfections, like we had with these recording sessions. But when you embrace life as it is, and all of a sudden, those walls that we raise up, where we would want to preserve ourselves, self-preservation then disappears, and it opens us up to the people around us to see what's in their worlds as well, and to appreciate them for who they are.
I love that. And as you were speaking through the identity part, right, and of the self-awareness of understanding that identity, and really, if we look at a timeline of life, and this is so because Dr. Joe Dispenza, I don't know if you know him, but he does a lot of work around understanding, and a simple analogy of like if we constantly building our future identity based on our past identity, then it's a very difficult process to kind of go, well, how do I ever get to becoming more than I am, future focused, basing everything on only the past? It's a beautiful process when you really go into that and really looking at what is my self-awareness and what is that story I would like to be telling myself. And part of what we generally do, because we are human and self-preservation is natural for humans, we tend to, I had this experience, I don't want it to happen now. But it also becomes how we identify with any experience, right? So until we are the self-awareness and really take into consideration what that self-awareness is, we tend to just base it on the previous past, right? And I always use that analogy of like, I can tell you the story of my dreary, terrible life, Or I can tell you, I had challenges in my world, but this is who I've become. It's just a framing. It's a beautiful way of getting your brain on board with how am I choosing to be in this moment, and what is my awareness around my language, my frame, my references, and how do I actively and intentionally tell this timeline story? And I think that's why we're having this conversation, because emotional intelligence, emotional awareness is not simply like, yes, humans have, we have these emotions, we should be aware. It's far deeper, it's far more complex than just kind of going, making it so simple. It's not simple. It's quite complex. And if we lean into the complexity of what your brain and your body and your experience is formulating and wanting you to understand more about yourself for that moment, it's a really beautiful thing. And I think that's what's so beautiful about emotional self-awareness around this conversation.
Yes. I love what you're saying about leaning into it. Let's, for example, talk about anger. For me, that was an emotion that I had to navigate in my life as well. Having grown up in a way that you want to do the right thing with people, the first response could be when you see that emotion coming up to judge yourself. And then we almost have the analogy again of pushing the ball under the water. And we can keep it there for a certain period of time, but the deeper you try and shove it in under the water, there's going to come the time where you become tired of that. And then the way in which it pops up then, or out, the force with which it comes out depends on how far you've tried to push it down. And when we make space for that, to, like you say, the questions, why do I feel angry? We spoke about the timeline earlier of our lives and how different things happened in different seasons. And I've even discovered that question as well with some of my clients. Instead of asking about something that has happened now, often it is an emotion. It's just a familiar emotion or a comfortable way of being, a state of being that often calls back that emotion as well. To be able to see, is that emotion here because of something that has happened now? Or is it here because of a memory that's lingering and it's there and it's draining my energy? So it's beautiful to look at these things. You also use the word beautiful, and the things that we tended to think are things we don't spend time with or look at. It's beautiful when we pause to make time for those things. I'm thinking in relationships as well, the other awareness. They say we respond in previous years, they said we respond with fight or flight when we feel a threat. Later years, they also said that sometimes we freeze. But if we could, when we're in a uncomfortable situation, in discomfort, in a conversation, if we could embrace that discomfort, not fight, not flight, not freeze, and open up to the discomfort, we can become like mirrors for one another. We can have that typical scenario that keeps popping up in a relationship, and we tend to shut down that relationship instead of still being in it and fully being in it, vulnerably being in it. And we actually open up a space for someone else then to reflect on their responses, where we could also be part of healing relationships instead of walking away from them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the fact that, because then it ties back into how aware am I aware? And as you were speaking through this now as well, I relate to it as which is always, I always preface this with every single conversation very often, especially in a coaching capacity, is the context and the content, right? What is the context of the experience you're having, and how is it tied into that emotional situation? And tell me about the context where you experienced this, and what exactly was the content? Because that in itself, we frame information in the way that we do, whether that's from a personal belief, from a value system, whatever. We do frame through a set of lenses based on the context and the content that we're experiencing. And that's why, when we do lean into that emotional conversation and the self-awareness and other awareness and empathy and self-motivate, all the things you've mentioned, is when we lean into it like that, I always say that you can't judge something. You can't judge something when you're curious about it. Just lean into curiosity, because that's going to serve you a lot more than kind of judging and bringing into a judgment conversation. Rather go, well, that's really interesting. Like, I wonder why. What is the intention there? So the curiosity leads us to far more than just judging it.
Yeah, so true. Curiosity, when we are curious or when we are not curious, we can easily just let a situation in terms of context and content confirm to us a preconceived idea. But when we become curious, affirm something to us, we get the chance to look at it in a deeper way. I think another thing that happens is competition or comparison. So we look at other people and how they would respond, and we think that that's the right way, or we should feel that way too, or we should respond that way too. But because of context and different stories that we lived in, when we have grace with ourselves as well, and when we love ourselves as well, it enables us to love our neighbors better. We can then, instead of comparison or competition, we can discover see things that we wouldn't notice before.
I love the word grace, and I think it's so important, because we if you just think, like, how can I bestow some grace on myself? Because if I can do it here, I can probably do it there. And usually, if you can't do it there, it's a good indication that you can't do it here. Right. So it's a beautiful frame to kind of look at, and potentially ask yourself the question, do you live in grace at all in your day? In this hour, have you bestowed some type of grace somewhere? Because, the reticular activation system tells us that, focus on the thing that you would like to see in the world, and you'll see more of that. Right. So I love the word grace. It just changes the positioning of, like, how would I like to show up? It's a beautiful frame.
That's so powerful to think of it that way. When you're saying that now, I'm thinking of an incident earlier this morning. Anxiety is also a huge part of my life when we look at the 5 areas of emotional intelligence, one of them is self-management. So if you feel that sense or the inkling of anxiety pops up, when we judge ourselves and think, I'm still feeling that, it's just actually making it worse. But when we lean into it and have grace with ourselves, it helps us with an understanding. It makes self-management easier. One of my daughters came to me earlier this morning, and I had to drop my youngest off at work, and my other daughter came to me about something she wanted to discuss about her future. And I found myself being short, which I don't do with my daughters. And when I found that, I realized it's because I don't have a lot of headspace. I'm prepping for this recording with you. And so I'm here in this hour between 11 and 12 instead of being with her. So having grace with ourselves also enables us to communicate better, because I can then explain to her, okay, I don't have a lot of headspace now, but I would love to hear what you're saying. Can we make a time then? And then we discuss. So it takes so much pressure off, and it helps us to live life fully. And it also helps us deal with the myth of perfectionism and a perfect day.
I love that you bring that conversation into self-management based on the fact that, and we're seeing this more and more and more and more, especially on social media, is self-management in of itself is an accountability action.
Yeah.
And, when you are not self-managing, you are not accountable for your own behavior.
Sure.
So, when you really hone it in and you really pay attention to, and this is beautiful about why the EQ conversation is so important, is because, there's so much significant evidence. I've written a book about, The Future of Work is Human, where they speak about self-management as one of the most important critical key human elements and skills that we'll learn for the future of work, purely based on the fact that if you can't manage self, the people who do will lead the future. So you're kind of going, we have to. We're not at the point where you are, everyone's entitled to a reaction, but as much as you're entitled to the reaction, you're accountable to that reaction. So how you then show up and what you do after that reaction is also your self-management approach. And the reason why you should have this awareness is because it's no one else's responsibility but yours to manage self. And I love that, just the fact that you recognize this person I love, I've had a triggered moment with them, and processing that, kind of going, sure, I don't have the headspace because of this and this. Let's set up some time specific for that. And I think we tend to not realize or do that because, for me, when people say that, especially my daughter, and she's like, well, this is just who I am. Then I'm like, well, stop doing that. Change, because it's not useful. Because essentially, we all have to be accountable for who we are and how we show up. And we can't just lambaste and have this reactionary behavior in life and walk all over people. Because that's just who you are. If that's just who you are, it's not good enough. Be better, right? And it's a strong kind of sentiment, but it's true. We have to be accountable. We have to. I make reference to South African government very often and lots of governments. There's this enormous push for accountability. It's not good enough. We have to be better, right? And I think that ties into leadership. It ties into relationships. It ties into why are we even having an EQ conversation after the last 10 years? We know for the last 10, 20 years, EQ, the agenda of EQ has been so important. And we're still here because it is so important to be able to have this conversation. Just on that note, what is your sentiment about why are we still talking about EQ? What do you think? Because for me, I think it's an accountability measure that's really important.
Yeah. Definitely. I think accountability is huge. I think we like putting the blame on someone else. But even though coaching is an area or a field that has emerged so much over the past few years, if you think, for example, teaching, how long that has been around versus coaching.
Yeah.
I love coaching compared to, for example, psychology, psychiatry, is that coaching doesn't tell somebody what to do. It helps them to become aware. It creates a space where you ask questions and they find it for themselves. So I think we love telling people what to do, but when we create more opportunities for them to find for themselves why they do what they do, I think when they see it for themselves, it's so much they want to make the shift. It's also accountability, I think, and ownership goes hand in hand as well. So when we have somebody else's answers, we are the owners instead of them. When we encourage ownership, where we guide them to find their answers, they become owners of their decisions. And I'm thinking of after COVID, how big delivery companies has become. A delivery company doesn't just drop your parcel on the stoop. They will phone and make sure that you get it and make sure that they've delivered it and you have it in your hands. And I think we often do that in conversations where we don't know whether what we said or delivered has been received or not. So I think like strategic shifts, and that comes to emotional intelligence as well, as to how we deliver that package so that it is received and opened up by the other person and then utilized where it becomes an active change instead of just words.
I think also a nice frame or a nice question to ask, especially in that context, is, how's that working for you? Yeah. So when we have, especially, and I've been in many coaching sessions where my coach says that to me, it's like, well, this and that. And the simple question is, well, how's that working for you? And you go, well, it's not working. And he's like, okay, well, maybe you should change it, right? So it's really just understanding that in that emotional connection of like not wanting to be accountable for the response and the reaction, you're like, I have to realize that no one's going to do it for you. No one's going to, unfortunately, especially when it comes to an emotional response like this and taking responsibility, doesn't matter what timeline you have, right? And that in itself is still a decision and a choice that you have to show up for yourself And I think that ties into that grace and accountability conversation we had earlier, is to kind of go, I really do have a choice. It's my choice on how I choose to respond today.
That's powerful. I do have a choice. And I think we live in such a fast-paced world. Afrikaans, I always tell my daughters, a kid's koffiekultuur. So we want things to happen quickly. We don't have time to pause a day and say, okay, something here doesn't sit well, and ask that question. We need to ask. We rather jump on somebody with the solution because it has to get done, instead of building that pause for somebody to invite more decisions from others as well, collaborate better, draw more out of other people, preserve relationships instead of just having solutions and getting to finish a task.
Yeah, absolutely. You also mentioned self-motivation. Speak to us about that, and how would we unpack that?
Self-motivation, again, it comes to awareness, and it comes to looking deeper than the surface. Somebody who appears to be lazy might not just be lazy because they don't want to do the work. There can be something like fear that they're not going to do it well. For example, if we look at anxiety, and that's something I've seen in my own life, anxiety and how it can play into depression. Anxiety is a very high amount of energy, wanting to do something extremely well, and it can almost paralyze, to the point where it can paralyze the owner of the anxiety, where depression, for example, is a very low energy, where there isn't enough motivation to do something about it. So if we, for example, put anxiety and depression on a continuum, it's a good example for me of self-motivation. Once again, to just pause and go deeper and not just take it as you see it.
And also, having been busy in this for the last 20 years, I've also recognized that people often, especially in a corporate environment, will say, I have this procrastination thing happening and I don't know how to get out of procrastination. And it's never about procrastination. It's usually based in a root cause. And I'll say I'm making a generalization, but it's usually based in a root cause of I don't want to fail, or I don't want to look bad, or I don't have control over what the outcome might be. So I'd rather not do something than do something and get judged.
So true.
And it's true. So the laziness aspect, you mentioned laziness, and the anxiety, the depression, all of that. And again, it's a generalization. Large part of that could be fueled by a root cause of something that we simply are not aware of. And that's why having a good coach, and sitting and unpacking it to that degree will really serve, because when you start looking at it from those root causes, then it's easy to be self-motivated based on the fact that you actually know what this limit is, or this agenda that you might be having in your head is kind of trying to say, and understanding and unpacking it to that degree. You're like, oh, okay, it's not about not being self-motivated. It's about the fear or the anxiety or the uncertainty, right? It's a beautiful, again, for me, it's a very beautiful thing about the brain.
Yes. I love what you're saying. And it takes it from judgment back to being curious again. It takes it from labeling somebody back to grace, where there's opportunities for change and growth, where coaching does a huge part as well.
Yeah, and I think it's taking it back to curiosity for me. That is always, when I don't understand someone's behavior, I'm immediately go to, I wonder why they behave that way. I wonder how that makes sense for you, because I don't understand how that makes sense for you, especially when I'm experiencing negative behavior from anybody. I kind of go, I don't see how you see that. It'd be interesting to see how your brain got there.
Yes.
So you also mentioned other awareness. Speak to us about that.
Okay. So again, let's put the word curious in there. For example, and let's use anxiety. It often happens to me where I want to talk to somebody and they're not available in that moment, or they'll not say it, they'll brush me off, and you can take that as rejection. Instead of being aware what they are going through, that they have a lot to do, they are anxious about getting it done, so they don't have time for it now. And when I speak to them again later, I could get a completely different response. So I think sensitivity in that place of looking at other people differently instead of just judging their behaviors, but being curious about why they are acting that way now. It could just prolong relationships, help us to have grace with other people. Instead of going into fight or flight, we can just be open to what they are experiencing. And I think what it will do for our teams and teamwork is absolutely amazing.
Yeah, I love that. And the last one I just want to touch on is empathy. Now, in one of our previous conversations, and I'm using my own words, you get healthy empathy and you get unhealthy empathy, right? Or unpack that for us, because I think very often people kind of look at empathy and they think of it as a certain type of way because it's been spoken about so often. Unpack that, because I think there is aspects to it that we need to be more aware of.
Okay. That's a topic that I just love because it's a very big part of my life. And it has been in times or seasons in my life where it actually led to burnout, because empathy is the place where you almost feel, or you do feel, the other person's emotions, where their emotions almost become contagious. But in that place, you actually, and there is the time where it's necessary to sit with them in that hole. But when it overtakes you in such a way that you keep with them there, you stay with them there, you are of no help to them. So healthy empathy, managing ourselves as well, taking care of ourselves as well, helps us not to just sit with pity that then goes to feeling sorry for them, to feeling sorry with them, which is empathy. It actually moves us further to the place where we can be of real significant help to them, where it goes to compassion. And compassion is the healthy place of empathy, where we still have our own capabilities intact so that we have something to offer and be of accurate assistance to that person in what they are going through.
I love that. And I think you were pointing out to sometimes it's necessary to be with a person in the situation. Sometimes you have to recognize when you're actually just having a pity party. Yes. And I think it comes back to context. You know, what's the context of the situation? Who is it about? You know, when it comes to my daughter, it doesn't matter what happens, I will pity party with her. But you know, and to a far greater degree than I would with anyone else. But it's the context of the empathy is like, it's my daughter, right? So, you know, and I think that's so important as well, because sometimes we believe that we're showing empathy, but we're actually trying to save people the whole time, and we just hold them in the pity and you know, and we don't get them, we don't challenge their thinking to kind of go, okay, I know you're here. How do I help you move out of that, right? Because that is also it's a strong sign of empathy, that you want someone to do better. You want them to be better and feel better. But just constantly being in someone's misery because, you know, and again, it's contextual. Like, what is the context of the situation? What is the content of the situation? All of that applies to what it is you're doing. But also there's manipulation in that, because you know, I know Magda's a good listener, so if she can just listen to me, and then you kind of go, no, but there's a boundary there. Like, we can pity party, but then I'm going to stop you and go, okay, cool. We've now pity partied. What are you going to do? There has to be a do part. And I think that's the gray area that's so many people, when I speak to many people, it gets very gray because they're not sure where the boundary is. And this is the big practice that you have to have with people to kind of recognize, well, what are they saying? How are they behaving? How are they showing up, right? All of these things play into that.
Yeah. It's powerful what you said there, Kevin. And I think if I had to replace all of that with one word, it would be the word wisdom. Because something that could be the right approach now or in this context not or will not necessarily be for a different context or different situations, is to be able to make those decisions. But sometimes we first need to accumulate the tools in the toolbox, to have enough tools so that we can choose between different responses. So yeah, amazing work to do this, and amazing minutes to put into conversations like these.
I love it, yes. And thank you for doing this for the third time now. I love it. If you have to share, I mean, we've had an hour of conversation, and obviously I can hear that we could go on like this, but if you had to share like a big takeaway for why you want people to know about emotion and the importance and how this drives, humans, what would you take away message for people today listening?
I think it would be that nothing can replace this. I always say talking can heal the world. In the life we live in, the era we live in, we have AI and we have so much to our availability, but nothing can replace this. Human to human conversation, open conversation, connection. So I remember it was even before COVID, I heard on a news report the one year, in 2018, 2019, the UK has reported their highest stats in terms of loneliness. They said while it was the highest peak in terms of social media. So I just think that human aspect of connection, relationship, that's why I would want to support and embrace emotional intelligence, is for the sake of that.
I love it. And it, just to reiterate, talking can change the world.
Heal the world.
Talking can heal the world. And I believe that. And I think it's one of the reasons why I still do this show and,
Yes.
want to have these conversations, because I first and foremost benefit mostly from it. But, the conversations and the insights that we share is inevitably in aim of helping heal at some level. I love that. Magda, if we had to get hold of you, what's the quickest way to do that?
Magda, growth mindset coach.
Fantastic. And we will share that detail in the description box below, guys. So changing your thinking will literally change your life. Magda Dippenaar, thank you for being here. Thank you for chatting. And yeah, I look forward to many, many more conversations.
Amen. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you for what you are doing to heal the world. I love your show. So thank you for your time as well.
Thank you. I will chat to you soon. Cheers for now.
Kevin.